I've just finished playing through Champions of Norrath, Realms of Everquest on the PlayStation 2 on the channel, so it's time for another Paine's Games review, and we'll start off with a little background. Released in 2004 exclusively for the PS2, Champions was a spin-off of the Everquest franchise of primarily MMORPGs published by Sony Online Entertainment for PCs between 1999 and around 2006. Whilst full-fat Everquest was a sprawling high-fantasy MMO that set many benchmarks for all MMORPGs to follow for years to come, Champions of Norrath was a foray into bringing a small slice of that full-fat experience to the home console. Champions, however, is no Final Fantasy XI, the latter of which was released a whole 2 years earlier. I would posit that this was largely due to the fact that despite the PS2 Slim launching later in 2004 with its built-in LAN port, hard drives were still exceedingly few and far between on PS2 units, particularly in Europe and the UK, where my college roommate and I were probably the only people we knew had both a hard drive and a LAN connection network adapter bolted into our PS2 FATs. Given its release in early 2004, however, it seems logical to assume that Champions of Norrath was intended to help generate some lead-in leverage for the impending release of the slimline PS2, using the unprecedented success of the main Everquest title, as the game does allow players to log in over PlayStation Central and form parties with others online. So it seems a pragmatic choice to have the Champions project helmed by none other than Snowblind Studios and have them essentially reskin their incredibly popular 2001 game Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance with assets and a tale woven from Everquest lore, with Chris Avallone designing alongside Paul Knutson. So with that bit of background, let's look at the premise and story. So, Champions of Norrath serves as a prequel to the first mainline Everquest online MMORPG, placing the player in the role of a would-be hero of the world of Norrath, in which the broader Everquest story is set. The elves are in the heat of a raging war with the orcs, led by Pellis, who has built an uneasy alliance with vampire lord Vannerhorst and the goblins of the realm. Set over 5 acts, the player or players hack, slash and somewhat minimally cast their way towards the ultimate battle for the fate of pre-Everquest Norrath against the god of hatred himself, Inaruk. If you're getting strong Diablo vibes here, that's very understandable. Anyway, the story is swift and linear. The bad dudes are bad duding, from kidnapping the common folk and forcing them to work in the mines, to kidnapping the high elf Verona V and holding her captive in the Fortress of Hate. And you, our worthy adventurer, are cleaving your way as either a barbarian warrior, wood elf ranger, high elf cleric, erudite wizard or dark elf shadow knight to layeth the smacketh downeth at the hateful hotel. Now, there is a plot twist along the way that I won't spoil here for anyone who does want to play this, but frankly it kind of just breezes by in a script that front-loads so much telegraphing as to render the reveal itself both fully expected and lacking impact in equal measures. The story as a whole feels very much like a single side quest chain from mainline Everquest, scaled back to match the limitation of the target platform and burned to a PS2 disc, which on one hand is not necessarily a criticism. However, nothing in Champions draws one in or makes one care about anyone met along the way in any significant capacity. It certainly doesn't match the storytelling or world building of contemporaries such as Diablo and Baldur's Gate. It's also very short, but I'll talk a little more about that in a moment as we move on to gameplay mechanics, which are absolutely what one might expect from a game in the Baldur's Diablo genre. It's a relatively straightforward hack and slash that evokes a feeling much akin to that of Gauntlet, though without much of the charm, fun, or replayability. It has the standard RPG gameplay loops, clearing areas of goons, collecting gold, loot and XP, leveling up your character stats and choosing additional skills, spells or abilities from a fairly simple talent tree system, which actually felt quite refreshing. That is, not having to pore over pages of trees agonising upon which point to spend where. So definitely don't expect a deep RPG levelling experience as you progress through the game. Just spam points on the usual skills attributed to your class, pick the fairly obvious beneficial talents from the tree as preference dictates, and you should largely be all good. The controls are genuinely intuitive overall. Press cross to smash, triangle or circle to cast, R2 to heal, L2 to drink potions, hold R1 to block, and though thoroughly serviceable for such a title of the time, it's still frustrating to see a developer so close to an actually practical and beneficial use of radial menus, but just not implementing the method in a fashion we see much more commonly on console titles of this nature today. But I'll come back to that later. Let's move on to graphics and environment, which are honestly really very nice. Now, at the time of release, most folk would be playing this on CRTs in standard definition, which I personally feel would never do the graphics of this game as much justice as perhaps it should. Thankfully, I have both a modded PS2 FAT with HDMI and all the mod cons, and the option to run via emulation with all the additional bells and whistles that offers, and despite the odd pop-in rendering screen at the side of the screen in widescreen modes, which I confirmed applies whether you're using PS2 hardware with a PAL version or emulating the same, Champions of Norrath has a really appealing art style. I mentioned it in the streams, but the art style of this game feels like a somewhat lost form that blends iconic classical high fantasy and gothic themes associated with Conan the Barbarian, Dungeons and Dragons and so on, with just enough high volume colour and caricatured overstatement as to hit a happy medium between the two. Is somewhat nostalgic to see compared to today's post-Blizzard Activision Caltech Pixar slop landscape. Though much of the game is spent in dungeons, caves or otherwise subterranean areas, they are all rendered very nicely with lovely details in the textures, nice water effects for the era, and the enemies, though not super varied, all pop in their own ways. Magic effects, fire and such equally look really nice and do help one feel some power behind actions that instigate such effects. The couple of instances of outdoor adventuring is also pleasing to the eye, bursting with bright greens, yellows and blues when traversing an island or cleansing a forest of orcish foes. The player character has enough optional variables to satisfy any reasonable expectation from a title of the time, though throughout my playthrough I could easily see that none of the weapons or gear are likely to enthrall anyone through their appearance, unless one chooses to enchant a weapon with one of the varied charmed items to add a flash of lightning damage, for example. But of particular note over the last few levels spanning the end of Act 4 and Act 5, taking one from the heavenly clouds of the Elven Air Sanctuary down into the depths of fiery brimstone engulfing the Fortress of Hate, the latter of which had some really nice Cthulhian, Giga-esque environment design that showed off the artwork and lighting really nicely. Moving on to sound and music, which alongside the graphics as stand out for me in my playthrough, really the main two things, the graphics and the sound. The effects make battle throughout the game feel chunky and solid, whilst the enemies have a satisfying variety of both haunting and harrowing sounds. Environmental sound is actually also pretty peak, with several portions featuring hard panning screams of mortal terror whilst idling in dungeons that I genuinely wonder if the market would actually tolerate today. I'm not joking, it's actually pretty brutal and it works with really good effect. The voice acting is overall pretty good, with great recording quality, and other than one particular performance that sounds like Gollum on Thorazine, the actors do a good job of delivering what in many cases are incredibly cheesy lines. The atmosphere is most definitely immersive throughout though, and the score is really rather respectable. Now, the music was composed by Inon Zur, who may not be widely known as the guy that it seems alleges to be the guy that actually wrote all the music that Shuki Levy and Chaim Saban took credit for during the heyday of Power Rangers, Beetleborgs and all that. Seriously, it's a wild background. Go look him up before it gets scrubbed. Anyway, whatever the case with that is, the soundtrack for Champions features well-themed orchestrations that move the gameplay along and in some cases actually make it a lot of better experience, honestly. However, it is also the perfect segue into the shortcomings. First of which being that the soundtrack loops rather quickly in each level and there just isn't enough of it. As I highlight, the music actually genuinely lifted the experience and made it feel very rounded, but it just ends up audiologically edging you with hints of epic orchestral themes, only to loop around a handful of tunes. Secondly, the aforementioned controls. Now, Anyone that knows me knows that I'm not the biggest fan of radial menus. Hell, I hated it when they introduced that into Command & Conquer. Okay, but this here is the perfect example of where one could be perfectly implemented. You see, in the game you can only assign spells or talents to whatever to triangle or circle, which is obviously very limiting when you have to switch between 3 or more spells, particularly mid-battle. Now, the more frustrating aspect is that to change which spell or whatever you want to put on which button, you press the D-pad to reveal a radial menu, then hover over which spell you want and press triangle or circle to assign. So why don't you just hold L1 to bring up the radial menu, then flick the right thumbstick up to cast one spell, down for another, and so on through an 8-way pattern? Honestly, that was my penultimate gripe with Champions of Norrath, as Snowblind were right on the cusp of making the caster system way less of a chore, while also affording the player the ability to cast far more variety of spells far quicker. Unfortunately, it is what it is, which does somewhat limit the game overall, really. But overall, the single biggest shortcoming of Champions was how short a campaign it offers before unceremoniously dumping you back to the main menu for 2004's version of New Game Plus. Yeah, that's right, you ain't completing this sucker until you play the whole thing through again another 2 times. So to be clear, when you reach the final encounter on your first playthrough, no matter how badass you think your character is, you ain't. You get impooned like a basic bitch until you slog through the same campaign, grinding your level and gear until your peon ass is worthy of even damaging Inneruk. Which I ain't doing. Honestly, it ain't that much of a draw to experience the storyline over again. This did, however, cement my conclusion that the genuine garbage that every single enemy drops or whatever shop you encounter throughout the title tries to flog you was actually a deliberate act in order to force further playthroughs upon which the shops and drops improve in actual usability. Throughout the entire playthrough, even when equipping the best gear possible, it felt like one was always just a hair's breadth away from getting mobbed and pooned. Pair this with my player character itself constantly moaning about everything, literally, from carrying too much to it being too bright and sunny to this being no way to fulfill one's destiny. Dude, I was ready to ship my boy with Skylar from Cybermorph and eject them both into space. So in conclusion, I'm giving Champions of Norrath Realms of Everquest a PGR 5 out of 10. There's a lot to like about this game, and it was refreshing to play a title that doesn't make unreasonable demands on your lifestyle to get into like its MMO sibling. It is very easy to pick up and play, and it does also offer couch co-op in an effort to further satiate that gauntlet urge, but as a whole the game feels distinctly average, sitting evenly on the fence between yeah this is fun and I could happily never play this again. The story is far too short, underdeveloped, and with little progression over the whole. None of the characters land any particular connection, and its gameplay itself, in this day and age, definitely does not encourage one to go another 2 times through the campaign for a positive ending. Whilst I can understand the mindset, which was of course very common at this period in gaming, that by looping the gameplay round but with increasing levels of XP, items, difficulty, etc., the player is getting 3 times the value out of their purchase of the game. Unfortunately, it has always felt like the cheapest way to stretch out a game from Kid Icarus on the NES to even nowadays, where execs rebrand it as New Game Plus. I've always personally branded it as Fuck You Plus. We have your money and you're going to give it to us again for the sequel. Which in this particular specific case was Champions Return to Arms, released in 2005 for the PlayStation 2. But that's a tale for another day. Thanks for tuning in. Goodbye now.